Our topic today is breaking bias and barriers in higher education. Hi, everyone, and welcome to One Voice Evolving podcast, where we reclaim joy in DEI spaces. Here, we interview guests who are raw, real, and relatable, shifting the conversation from head to heart for white women who care about racial equity. I'm Kim Brasser, your host, and today our guest is Elizabeth Liz Staten, who holds a master's degree in counselor education from Clemson University. With a wide variety of DEI experience from human resources to student activities, she has now entered the functional area of dual credit. Elizabeth brings a DEI lens to any functional area she is in and to her community at large. Liz credits the grace of Black women she met along the journey of growing from a sheltered understanding of race and racism into the racial equity advocate that she is today. She often reflects that we as a collective of white women are undeserving of the grace we are granted in our journeys, unpacking and fighting against racism. But she feels this grace and deep connection with Black women has continued and will continue to inspire her journey. Today, our conversation focused on the importance of relationships as we explore this work and the need to educate the country on the seriousness of continued racism, systemic, individual, and personal bias. In the field of higher education, Liz is uniquely positioned to influence not only our students, but the educators who influence students as well. So if you know anyone who is a student or an educator or a parent who cares about those things, share this with them, like, comment, and be sure to visit our website, onevoiceevolving.com, for resources and recommendations. Enjoy. Staten, what drew you
Mhm.
to do DEI work to begin with, Liz?
Yeah, so I'll pack it all the way up to the very beginning of really my time in higher education. So I attended graduate school at Clemson University, which on paper is a counselor education degree, but really a lot of the thread, really in every course, every conversation, social justice is kind of the through line of what we're talking about. And so I came from a small town in Kentucky, was not born in Louisville. And so I went to the University of Louisville and had some classes that kind of started opening my eyes to, okay, I think I was I was born in a place that was very homogenous and really kind of fed that way in every decision that was made in the town. And so for me coming to Louisville, really kind of started to open that up for me. And so by the time I got to Clemson, I was pretty ready to have those conversations. And so you could see kind of the difference in students who were ready and those who weren't ready. And it kind of really your ability to work through that program depended on kind of where you started as a result. And so I'm so blessed that I was able to have that exposure, that education. But it was all through, really focusing on higher education, student affairs, but through the lens of social justice education. And so I started out thinking I wanted to be in student activities and maybe eventually, vice president of student affairs. But we had the opportunity to really look at it was a very hands on focused program. It was, we had quite a bit of coursework, but really the focus of the program was to get your hands on in functional areas that you were interested in or things that you didn't know if you would be interested in, but just wanted to try it out. And so we had our graduate assistantships, but then we also had pretty long and intensive internships and practicums alongside what we were doing in our coursework. And so for me, one of the first functional areas that I was interested in was multicultural affairs. And so I was able to get on as an intern for their international festival. And then really they couldn't keep me out of the door. I just kept coming back for every committee. And it was a very community focused, which this is why I love Clemson Multicultural Affairs is pretty much every initiative or large scale event, you have a team of like 10 plus people putting on programs and initiatives. And so it's not just one, staff person, one student, one faculty member. It's everyone. It's all three of those included, and the community of Clemson. They would bring in community members. So that was really kind of what piqued my interest in going into DEI work was really my experience in multicultural affairs. So my first role out of grad school was at Davidson College. I worked, it was a transition from more like faculty and staff focused DEI work. They transitioned it to an office that was only student facing. So we were the Center for Diversity and Inclusion. So I was their first program coordinator. And then my supervisor was the first, she was actually the assistant dean of students for diversity and inclusion. So she did a lot of the high level like bias intervention and things like that. And I was more the like boots on the ground doing the event planning, overseeing the spaces and the reservations processes, working with student organizations, collaboration for student advocacy work. And so I absolutely loved my experience there in my work with students. We had student employees who were really doing a bulk of the work. We were just kind of there to give guidance and advise them in what they were doing and, doing all the back end stuff that you have to do as staff, like ordering all the things that, students can't do. And so just absolutely loved my work there. And, universe has its way of, you think you're going one way and then universe pivots. So my partner actually got a position in Asheville, North Carolina, right when the pandemic hit. So we sent students home, and the same day he was starting his job in Asheville, North Carolina. And so, hiring freezes across the board, but really in DEI work specifically. I mean, it was higher ed in general, but DEI was like, in the time, this was 2020 and still probably is somewhat today, is, you have your fluff that, in a scenario where you need financial aid versus DEI, they're going to pick financial aid. And so it was, just shortages. And so I ended up getting on with a manufacturing company and ended up moving into human resources. And they really wanted me to bring that DEI lens and work into the role, which I was able to, which was phenomenal. But then we looked at moving back to Louisville, Kentucky to get closer to my folks. And so I was kind of open to what I was going to do in higher education. And so I ended up coming back to the student engagement realm, but we worked really closely with the DEI department. And so both were very new. Student engagement in terms of community college setting is really a new concept. And I think DEI is kind of in that same realm. And so how do we kind of create this synergy to where we can do it's a lot of the same work. It's just the lens can be different. So student engagement, we were looking at serving all students, whereas the DEI realm is looking at specific populations and how do we support them with the lens of social justice within each of those, and kind of even above the student engagement piece, how do we eliminate barriers that we as an institution are putting in place? And so that's where my brain lives, is the barrier piece. And so I'm now in a role that works with dual credit population. And that's where I really think the DEI and social justice lens will help in that. Dual credit is, I mean, it's still even relatively new if you look in terms of like decades worth of implementation and the state even being really involved in the execution of dual credit. For our high school students, there are still barriers that we see across the state for, depending on where you live, your access to dual credit opportunities are going to look completely different. And so racial justice shows up within that, socioeconomic status within racial justice shows up within that. So I think that lens is really going to help. But I'm just excited to be in something new and something different. And it's on the academic affairs side. So I'm getting to see kind of what that landscape looks like compared to the student affairs landscape. But in terms of pitfalls, I think one of the things that I noticed and that I was kind of grappling with is in DEI work, if another person's in DEI work, I just kind of assume that we're showing up on the same page, like with the same, not level of understanding necessarily, but the same gumption. And like, I don't need to necessarily spend the time in building a relationship with you as much as I would someone who doesn't have that lens, because we're already showing up in a lot of the same ways. And so that kind of was a big recognition for me is that, yes, I do need to spend the time in building those relationships. Um, and that's people who look like me, people who don't look like me. As a white woman in the work, it can be different depending on where you're at and what levels that you're talking to about this kind of work. And so I realized that sometimes I just show up and think that I'm at a better place in a relationship than I might be. And so just putting that effort in, putting the time in, the patience, because there's been work that's come before me and there's the work that'll come after me. And I have to realize that I could be a little piece of the puzzle and maybe plant a seed, and that's okay. I might not have to be a part of this, larger impact. But that's where I want to be. I want to be in those spaces where I've already gained that trust. And I have a certain privilege in higher education who's really for however long been predominantly white women ran, even in leadership now. How do I, set the stage to be able to use my privilege for good in those conversations to push back on things that need to be pushed back on? So yeah, that's what comes to mind for me in terms of the pitfalls and kind of where I'm at in my journey with DEI work in higher education.
So when you, in your particular neck of the woods and in your experiences, if the leadership is largely and has been largely white in the DEI space in these
Mhm.
places, how do you, how did that create for you particular challenges? You know, we get the privilege of, well, it's easy to go along to get along and be one of that
Mm,
crowd. Where did
mhm.
you get, where did you get the diverse voices to the table? Was that difficult for you?
Well, I think it is just kind of in general in higher education. I think what I've seen, and this is kind of from the outside now of DEI looking in, it's we rely heavily on Black women to do this work in higher education, but only at a certain level. So they might make, director level, AVP level, but a lot of times they're not positioned at a point in the college, maybe more so the four-year universities, but at least the community college level, I've seen that they're not positioned at a place where they're having the influence that they need. And so even if they're supported by higher up or direct supervision, there's still a lack of understanding because of the whiteness that is threaded throughout at that layer above them, that it just kind of it can get to a point and then it kind of stops. And so I haven't been privy to those conversations, so that's only just kind of my outside looking in. But I do think it takes for a white woman to be in such a high position in any area. I think it's going to take, and I've seen, I mean, there's people in institutional research that I see very far along in their journeys to where they're putting out research for us that is far ahead of what I've seen in even four-year institutions, just really showing diverse voices and the diverse student experiences in terms of the research that they put out to help inform the decisions that we make as a college. But it truly is, I think it takes an individual person to invest in that in their journey to be able to uplift the voices that aren't necessarily a part of the table that they need to be a part of.
Mhm. One of the comments you made in your questionnaire for this was that you felt inspired on your journey by the grace of Black women.
Mm.
Can you tell me
Mhm.
more about that?
Oh, absolutely. So I trying to see like how far back it goes. It probably goes much further back, much further than what I'm thinking of right now. But when I was in Asheville, North Carolina, there was a book club that was hosted by it's called the Rise organization based out of Waynesboro, Virginia. Two Black women that have co-founded this organization to really be a voice and uplift voices of the Black community where they live. And then they expand that broader to Virginia, and so they're really focused on youth in education. And so during COVID, one of the things that they wanted to bring to light was connecting with white women across the nation, who were really having this reckoning moment in June of 2020, to say, okay, what are things that we can help educate you on, through payment? Because we
Mhm.
shouldn't be paying, we shouldn't be letting Black women do this for free, right? That's on us, that's our responsibility. Um, but how can we have spaces where we can do book talks, have conversations about what we've learned? And these aren't just like the easy books to read. Like the books they were reading before I came into the fold were like really, really hard topics. And so they were bringing these white women in, and kind of like my experience in my graduate program, it was like, if you're ready to have these conversations, you are good. Some people kind of fell off. If they weren't ready to have it, it was kind of a weed out kind of thing. And so whether intentionally or not. And for the next step after the book talk, it was, how do we put this conversation into action? And so that's when I actually was introduced to the program through a friend that I was working with. We were actually on a reparations solidarity circle team together for the Asheville area. And she said, I think you would really love this group of women and what we're doing. And so for me, that was the pivotal moment where I realized, just in hearing from these two Black women, how much grace they've had for us for a full lifetime, and it helped me see, like, kind of look back at all of the Black women I'd been close with to see how much grace they had for me in the work. And whether it was personal work, professional work, they had given so much grace. And so for them to even have not said it aloud is even more so like what power of grace that they've had for us in doing this work. Because there's so many things that, and this actually comes from a book. I'm going to forget the name of it, but it's Catrice Jackson who wrote it. But it's basically white women in relationship and conversations with Black women. We're making these small cuts, like thorns on a rose. Is
Mhm.
what she equated it to. We're making all of these cuts over time. And so, whether you're in a relationship and saying these, things that are overtly racist, it can be these small things that just add up over time. And the fact that some of these women have still been willing and able to have relationship with us and pour into us, it's more than any grace I've ever seen from a white woman, I guess is how I'll put it. But I'm at a place now where I'm like, we just have to listen to Black women, period. That's it.
Yeah, and not compare our experience and our white skin to their experience and their black skin, because
100%.
yeah, that's the coolest
100%.
part, I think. Yeah.
Mm,
So how do
mhm.
you extend that grace that was given to you when you're working with less than
Oh.
enchanted other white women?
Mhm.
How do you do that?
Oh, that's a great question. And that's something I'm still working on and I'll probably work on for a lifetime. And I think it is the recognition of the grace that we've been extended that helps me show up in a much different way. When I first started, especially with white men, it was like, you have no room like for improvement. I was basically like, if you're at this certain place. Now I will say I did learn from the women of that organization that, at some points, some people, we don't have to give in to a conversation if we know that they're not at a place of learning or curiosity. Like we do have to kind of set a boundary for ourselves in those spaces. But at the same time, I've come a long way in terms of being able to see myself and other white women specifically to say, I do remember being there. And this is how I, would appreciate someone to talk to me about it if I were looking back at myself 10 years ago. So that's been helpful. But I think it's only by the grace of those Black women that I can do that today.
When I met you, you were working in higher education specifically on a DEI team. And just, I do change management for organizations. I have an HR background, and I always say,
Mm.
when people get hired new, they come in with fresh ideas and
Mm,
fresh enthusiasm, and we're going to change the world, and they think I'm going to watch how they do things for 3 or 4 or 6 months if I'm really patient. And then I come in with
mhm.
all the things that need to change because I so clearly see it. and then we're
Mm,
going to start making the shift. And when
yes.
it doesn't happen quite that way, when you find out that the way we've always done it before you got here is the way we're going to do it after you're gone, we'll wait you out. Or there's nothing, if they don't fix it. Or my question after 2020, did the pushback against DEI in higher education affect the trajectory of what could have, would have, should have happened there?
Mhm.
Let's talk to me about that a little more and your experience as the newbie.
Yes.
How
Yes,
was
absolutely. So, and I'll take it even back to when I was in DEI work at Davidson College. I was so new to the landscape, and there was a lot that I was having internal struggle with just in working through my own journey that I almost, not to change the past, but I probably could have used, oh, sorry. I probably, I probably could have used a moment to be in another functional area and still work on my DEI journey in another way, maybe a professional development or like a paid way, to then be at a place where I wasn't always second guessing myself. Because as a white woman in the work and so new to the work, that's what I was often doing. And I think it hindered a lot of what we could have done for our students. And so I always had that kind of internal grapple, and I didn't voice it a lot. I think if I voiced it a lot more, I would have been a lot better off. I was trying to kind of do it on my own, and I didn't realize the grace Black women had. I actually had a Black woman supervisor, and I think if I had realized that then, I would have had a lot more openness and conversation with her. And then I have to look back at that and see what racism was I bringing into that relationship to not fully trust her out the gate. And so that's something to think about as I look back on that moment. But in terms of being in higher education now, kind of taking that pause in manufacturing and then coming back, one of the things that I often think about is one of my friends that was in DEI work right out of grad school as well. He worked more specific with our Latinx population. It wasn't as broad DEI, but it was with our Latinx student population. And he said, Liz, I would wait. I've tried to do a lot of, change conversations a little too early. And so I do recognize that I need to wait and kind of see what is the landscape, what's the student population. And that's what I'm trying to bring into what I do now is I need to wait at least a year to see what's a full cycle look like before I try to talk anything strategic level, because anything that I have that might be a, fresh or different perspective or idea, I need to make sure it fits what we're doing because not everything needs fixed, not everything needs changed. But particular to DEI work, I think truly being on a team who's giving feedback into the institutional changes, they have to be backed up by teams who are also having those conversations. Like it all can't live within the DEI department. It needs to be, and I think where I work does a pretty good job of how do we expand this into the conversations everyone's having, not just keeping it siloed in one little old department. Um, and so I think that's really important, but I also think it can be done pretty poorly or done wrong if those conversations aren't facilitated by people who know the work. It can turn into more of a checkbox, which can be even more harmful to an institution. That's a lot of what we've talked about in my grad program and just kind of through the years is what feels like more of a checkbox, to make sure that, our employees of color or students of color feel welcome versus the actual gut level work that really needs to happen.
Right, yeah. So we check the box so that so the federal government gets what they,
Hmm.
but,
Hmm.
on the floor, the way we really do things around here hasn't changed nearly enough.
Absolutely.
Nearly.
Absolutely.
When people of color would come in as a student and they would see that the way we say we do things is not really the way it feels to be here, what
Yeah.
would that do to their academic progress?
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is similar to any employee that's coming on into a new corporation or a new institution. It's the same thing where I've read about this, so I can't talk experience because I'm not a woman of color. But what I've read is you come in, and I think this was actually in the same Catrice Jackson book that I mentioned earlier, is coming in, it's kind of this like hope of, oh, it might be different, and then day 3, you're seeing the same culture. It doesn't take long to see through the facade, and so for students, I think that happens within the first hour of who they're talking to, and so that's actually one of the projects I wanted to work on, through the Rare Women's Collective was, how do we change the first point of contact? How do we change the culture to truly having people look at our students? So any staff, whether you're in admissions, financial aid, whoever that first point of contact for our student is, they're all able to shift from an assets based lens from the deficit based lens, because just in general conversations, that's what comes up and comes out, and whether they're conscious of it or not. Most of the time they're unconscious about it, until we do a formalized training on, you might be approaching a student with a deficit lens, especially in the community college setting. We all have been guilty of it until we're aware of it. And how do we shift that to an asset based lens? And so that starts with our students of color, but it expands even beyond that in looking at socioeconomic status, first generation college students, if we have single parents that we're advising. There's just so many layers to how we're showing up for students in a deficit lens, to where if we just really tweaked it to be an asset base and compassionate, first impression, it would completely change the landscape of our students. And so I don't know the data because that's what I was hoping to get from from this project, but just in terms of the numbers that we see, in terms of the culture shifts for students feeling like they belong, that's where it lives. And so that's where I was really focused with that project.
So do me a favor and give me examples of what a deficit-based lens is and what an
Mm.
asset-based lens is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm taking this example from a colleague as we were talking about this. I love this example. So let's say we have a student that we're looking at a second chance, second opportunity, which, at least in North Carolina, that's the language we use. I don't know what we use here in Kentucky as much, but anyone who's coming out of the jail system or prison system, how do we take that experience and look at, oh, you've lost all these years. This is where you're starting behind someone that's your age, and look at it as a place of, what are the skills that you gained in whatever work or any experience really in the jail or prison system that you could now apply to being a student. I think that's a great example because it's kind of extreme for folks who don't really believe in the second opportunity landscape. But for me, that's a prime. How do we take from, you're starting at this place, this is how far you're behind, we need to get you here, to actually these are all the skills you bring, here's what we need to put you in that will get you to where you want to go next. And how do we formulate goals according to what your experiences have been, and not looking at them as negative experiences, looking at them as, what fruit can we get from that to then apply to your future.
You mentioned how if you had taken a pause sooner to be able to work through your own racist biases or belief systems, how that might have impacted the work that what you brought to the table.
Mhm.
And one of the things that white women like me love to do is go to a book study, and we learn and we learn and we
Mm.
learn, and then we
Mhm.
use the excuse of, well, I can't do it perfect, I'm afraid of making
Yes.
mistakes, so I'm not going to do anything. If you can't do it right, don't tell anybody. But know
Mhm.
that you have these biases that are clearly evident just in our speech patterns that we're
Mhm.
unconscious of. And
Yes.
so, and so if someone were starting out to work in the school, in an education system, no matter what grade level, what
Mm,
would be maybe an efficient route for them to work through their bias
mm.
in a timeline that makes sense, so that we don't lose another 3 years to, but I have to know more before I can do
Oh,
anything.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can kind of share from the high school level, like our teachers who were in the high schools. One thing that I've learned actually very recently is that there's a certification, and I'm not going to be able to pull the name of what it is. That's how new it is to me, but essentially in this certification process there's the certain things that you need to have, like certain objectives, and one of the new objectives that they've added is equity and inclusion. And so for me, it's while you're in the learning process of becoming a teacher, learning those pieces, because my assumption is a lot of that is probably high level big picture about structural racism, but really looking at the individual level, I would assume is part of the program. I would hope. And so for me, that I think is key. It's important to showing up in the ways that you need to show up. But where we're having issues and having trouble are these states that are saying you can't teach any of that. And so for me, it's really trying to figure out what in what ways can we teach that to those who are going to be taking this across, our nation, to students in the way they teach. How do we do that in a way that isn't going to be ripped from us, through legislation or whatever that looks like? um, but I think it also kinda on the flip side of that, it starts in the schools, and this is why we're having the issue is they're saying you can't talk about anything related to identity in K through 12 in certain states, and that's where it starts. That's where I wish we had a conversation when I was in the 8th grade about whiteness. I mean, I would be so much further along in my journey by the time I was in college that I would have been having much different conversations, and I'd be able to conquer the world a lot sooner than I feel like I am right now at 33, but I think the earlier the better. And there's actually, and I'm gonna blank on her name too.
Afterwards, I'll put it up on our, as a resource on
Perfect. Oh, beautiful,
this
beautiful.
podcast.
Yeah, and there are I can share some other resources too of in terms of like conscious tests, unconscious bias tests, things like that. But for this woman in particular, she's written children's books around whiteness. She has some other phenomenal work about grief, but the hard topics that adults kind of steer away from because we're not ready to have those conversations with children, they're able to read in a book with their child. And then, Ibram Kendi has children's books about anti-racist work. So it's like the earlier we start, the better in my eyes. That's how I look at it. It's not you have to have a certain timeline to be able to do it. It's actually just starting the first step, because for me, there, like I said earlier, there's just so much that it hindered that I could actually do because I was so self-conscious about actually showing up and doing the work. And it's just an excuse. It's another excuse to feel comfortable. And I still have those moments where I choose comfort over discomfort, but I try to choose discomfort more so than comfort. But it takes a long time.
Yeah, yeah. And I really think that sometimes simple is better. If I
Mm,
have grandchildren, and if I get an anti-racist book about white people for my granddaughters, that I can sit and read it with them, then at that is the level at which my development never began.
mm,
And
mhm,
and honestly, that might be just the best baby step to take. You don't have to go
mm,
out and change the world or get a degree or work in the field or
mhm,
fight any of that, just to learn
mhm,
about what do they mean by unconscious
mm,
bias, because we're
absolutely.
steeped in it. Yeah,
Mm.
all of us.
Oh, absolutely. And it's just triggered for me that the more I learn, the more I want to know. So I mean, I've kind of joked recently. I choose to do environmental racist um justice bus tours on the weekends. Like that, I'll wake up at 8 a.m. on a Saturday to do that. Like it just, there's such a fuel and a fire that I don't think I can ever put out, that it's the more I'm learning. And I had to get to that point. I don't think I made a conscious decision to go from reading all the books to doing the action. I don't think there was ever a like, Liz, you need to change this. It just kind of happened. Like I got the confidence after so much work and conversations that I was able to do it. And now I'm here with you on a podcast. Whereas, 15 years ago, I would have said, what? I was talking about what? And so for me, it's like, yeah, I didn't come with a script. I'm just talking with you honestly and what my experience has been. And
Yeah.
maybe I'll think about something I said later and be like, ooh, I would have said that differently. But now it doesn't matter. I'm doing the work with you, and that's what's important.
And that's perfect. And we really are just in this moment doing a next baby step, because somebody listening this is going to get a nugget they can share with somebody. And that's the whole point. I
Oh, I love
love your
that.
energy and your passion. I always have. It's refreshing. And one of the things that I'm doing a podcast at this late stage of my life, and
Oh, it's
it
amazing.
makes me laugh that it is the work with small groups through the Rare Woman Collective that even allowed me to be in the same space with you, and to see and
Yes.
feel your energy. And
Yes.
we cannot do this work in a silo. We
Mm,
can't do it alone, and we can't do our inner work where we work in our workplace,
mm,
because there's too
mhm.
many rules and roles, too many hats, too
Yes.
many expectations. And so
Mm,
it has to be a group of like-minded women, wherever and whatever that is, where you can be raw, real, and relatable there
mm,
too.
mm.
And that is where the healing happens. And then
Oh,
from there, the outgrowth of that is you can take it out into the tourisms or the education or
oh,
whatever. But I love when it
absolutely.
flows from you and it
Mm.
brings new life.
Oh, and that's one of the things that I loved from Dr. Nikki Lanier was we have to heal too. Like this is ever reaching. It's not black or white, it's all of it. And so the fact that we can come together and do this to heal, 100% absolutely agree. It's just amazing. The fact that you're putting this on and putting it out to so many people who I hope listen and take it all in for what it's worth. I'm just super grateful to have met you and that you're able to put something out like this. It's
Oh,
phenomenal.
thank you for participating. Now, the next thing that happens is on our web page at onevoiceevolving.com. I will put your information and like 3 references or resources. So if you want to
Oh,
send those to me, I wrote
perfect.
some of them down. But if you'll send them to
Beautiful.
me after this, then we'll get it up, and then people can link to it, and it's just more resources. So I'm
Perfect.
just starting a library over there. If you have books that you
Mm,
recommend, give me the
yes.
recommended readings, and I'll throw it
Perfect.
up. And and we're building a library, building a
Oh,
community.
amazing. That's fantastic. Absolutely. I will absolutely send those to you.
Wonderful. Liz, thank you so much, and I wish you well in your next endeavors. And if I ever get to where you are, I want a weekend tour
Yes,
myself.
absolutely.
So
Same to
fun.
you.
All right, you take care.
Thank you, Kim. You as well.
Okay,
Bye.
stop recording.